Do you want to maximize your success with NCUA? Join Mark Treichel as he shares with you the insider's view on passing your exam with flying colors. The With Flying Colors podcast is sponsored by Credit Union Exam Solutions by Mark Treichel. If you would like to work directly with the Credit Union Exam Solutions team and receive support to optimize your results with NCUA so you save time and money, visit us at marktreichel.com to find out more.
Hey everyone, this is Mark Treichel with another episode of With Flying Colors. I'm excited today that we're going to be talking about the National Supervision Policy Manual and the NCUA Examiner's Guide. I've got two of my team members here that, if you're a longtime listener, you're very familiar with them, Todd Miller and Steve Farr. Guys, how you doing today?
Doing well. Good. Yeah, up by Glacier Park today, so it's got to be a good day.
Living the dream. Hey, we got a lot of longtime listeners, but we might have someone who stumbled across us here the first time, either based on the topic in a Google search or who knows, just a new listener. So Todd, if you could give a little bit of your background at NCUA for those that are listening, what you did at NCUA before you switched teams with Steve and I to help credit unions.
Sure. I spent about 34 years with NCUA. I can break my career down into about three different parts. I spent a decade or so as an examiner and a problem case officer. Then I spent a decade or so as a capital market specialist. I had a last year at Westcor, basically after NCUA conserved it, where I spent time there under you. Then I spent about the last 11 years of my career as a director of special actions in the Western region, supervising troubled credit unions, problem case officer, capital market specialist. Got to sit on a lot of internal committees at NCUA during that time. Was a member of their supervisory review committee for handling appeals. So an enjoyable 34 years altogether.
Very good. Yeah. Interesting times. And on that last year, I was the acting director of the corporate program at the time. We had some retirements at NCUA and, of course, the corporate crisis. And I was thinking the other day relative to that. Funny story. At least it's funny to me. I used to read books on the way out to California when we were doing the Westcor conservatorship. And I was watching a TV show a couple years back, and I thought, you know what? I think these are the books I read. It was Bosch on Amazon Prime. So I think I read every Bosch book known to mankind on the flights to Westcor. And then on the red eyes back, I would listen to Dave Matthews Band live with Tim Reynolds in Las Vegas because it was acoustic and it was easy to listen to. And after about 6 months of doing the red eyes, my wife finally told me, I don't know why you do that, because when you come back, you're angry. So you might as well stay another day.
Yeah.
All right, Steve, let's hear your NCUA synopsis of the time you spent at NCUA.
Yeah, I'm going to gear my comments specific kind of the topic of the day, and that helpful. And that my career is really two parts versus Todd's three. And that I spent the 15 years as in the examiner ranks out in the credit unions. And as a problem case officer, I was involved in a lot of administrative actions and a few conservatorships and a lot of items that are covered in today's subject. And I was a big user, of course, of the examiner guide. And then I spent the last half of my career, an additional 15 plus years, in the central office, where we would be working on the development of guidance and the NCUA supervisory letters and those types of things that were produced to try and help examiners and credit unions understand the regulations and what the NCUA is doing. I think those parts of my career will come in handy today.
Yep, very good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this chat. And I remember I started on Columbus Day, 1986. They gave me, my first day was a annual holiday. And they told me that the paperwork was too hard to start me on a Tuesday. And I asked my trainer what I should do. And he said, pull out the examiner guide and read it. Pull out the Federal Credit Union Act and read it. And I remember that beautiful blue binder with those really slick connectors on the side. It was the coolest binder I've ever seen in my life. I think I might have finally gotten rid of that. But yeah, it was Todd. I think you might still have it, or he's looking to see if he has it. Hey, this is a podcast. You couldn't see Todd move, but he looked like he was checking to see if it was there on the shelf. So anyway,
if it is, it's down on the library in the basement. I might have gotten rid of it, but yes, I carried that blue binder around for many years.
It was quote unquote our NCUA Bible there for a while. All the answers were between those two blue biters. Very good. All right. So who wants to go first? We've got the NSPM, which came later. We've got the examiner guide, but maybe a little bit of history of how we got here to kick this off.
I can start on that and Steve can fill in the blanks if he would like, or we'll let Steve talk and I'll fill in the blanks if he likes.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted up was we'll talk about the history of it. The exam guide's been around before we were even around in some shape or form. But the one that caught my attention was, let's talk about the newer document, the National Supervision Policy Manual, and why did that even get developed? I was at a conference when the first discussion came through and that the NCUA board is going to require that we put together this, basically a procedure manual. And so I wonder if you guys had the thoughts as to remembering why that came about and see if they match what my recollection on that is.
So I have Todd, you go ahead. I have some definite thoughts on it. Let Todd go ahead.
I think the two are really tied together in a lot of respects because the NSPM, the National Supervision Policy Manual, came into being. NCUA de-emphasized the exam guide. But back when Mark, Steve, and I started, that exam guide was our primary document that told us how to do our job. It was in hard copy. The internet, really, none of that was online back then. And they even mailed up updates. We got little packets. Take out this page, put in this page. But over time, the regions all had developed their own different ways of actually doing their work. Their project plans for the year, how they administered exams, how they put in place enforcement actions, how they wrote doors, findings. It became like 6 little different agencies. And there were some similarities there. You had an exam guide that tied them together, but each regional director and directors of supervision had a huge influence on how each of the regions were operated. And as examiners would sometimes work on teams that crossed regions, that created challenges because they would do their work a little different way. So you'd have some of these internal issues when examiners worked across regional lines. And we did that sometimes when there were staff shortages. And the other thing is credit unions, it's a small world. They all talk to each other. And so they knew about all the differences too. And complaints would find their way back to NCUA board members. I believe it was Ms. Matz was the chairman when the first NSPM came out. I might be wrong about that, but I think it was Ms. Matz when they first came out. Ms. Matz said, hey, this is not acceptable. The regions need to all be on the same page. And that led to that first National Supervision Policy Manual as a way to get the regions on the same page and doing their work and administrating their programs in the same manner. And as that NSPM came out, there was a de-emphasis on the exam guide. And over time, there's more and more has been put into the NSPM. It's up to 420 some pages now, but it gives you a pretty good idea how NCUA supervises and administers their exams and enforcement programs.
Steve, anything you want to care to add to Todd's synopsis there?
All I can remember is because I was at a conference with it was basically all of E&I was at it, and this word came down on that. And we had that normal reaction on resistance to change, the same as credit unions deal with when something comes along, and that we were like, oh man, why in the world do we need this? This is going to be nothing but trouble. And plus, I think we were thinking it's going to be a lot of work to put together. I remember that initial resistance to change it. My recollection is the same as Todd, in that there was probably just a particular couple issues that made it all the way up for board actions or something that were done quite differently between regions, and the credit unions involved were being pretty animate, probably correctly so, about why are we being treated differently depending on what region we're in.
Yeah, both of your memories are similar to mine, and Todd, you are right. It was board member Debbie Matz that pushed for this, and I can remember. So I transitioned from regional director to executive director on January 1, 2013. And I can specifically remember being at a NASCUS meeting where we also had a regional director meeting. There was also, it was either the kickoff meeting to the NSPM or the second or third meeting of the NSPM. And I can remember My representative in Region 1 at the time, Albany, was Rebecca Palowitzinski. Sherry Freed at the time, who, by the way, is about to retire from NCUA, was a representative, I think, from the Western region at the time. And that introduced the topic of layering. The concept was the board would come out with a regulation, NCUA would come out with some guidance. And then, Todd, as you said, the regions would layer their own thoughts on top of that. And layering became banned. And the only way that something could be changed would be via this new vehicle, the NSPM, and that would be through this committee. So if a regional director in the old ways said, you know what, code 3, I don't want to do 90-day contacts, I want to do 73-day contacts, they could do something like that. Now, if they wanted to float that idea, it had to come to this committee. And as there are no, in the whole planet, there are no statutes for committees because committees tend to slow things down. Sometimes they make things better, but it made NCUA more consistent, but it made them a little bit less nimble and a little bit more bureaucratic. And we might tip into some of that bureaucracy a little bit later. But yeah, that's the interesting times, those transitions.
I have a story kind of related to that. So I was the director of special actions. The first one came out for staff comment. And a lot of the policies and procedures in that very first one that came out for staff comment exempted the division of special action. Then the actual first version came out. All those exemptions were gone. So I didn't put a lot of comment in it because, hey, I'm exempt from all of this. I'm exempt from all of this. And then when actually version 1 comes out, I'm no longer exempt from it, even the division of special actions, which does quite often have to move quickly. Now they had to follow every single thing in the guide too, where in the first draft version, divisions of special actions were exempt. So I wasn't very happy with the first version when I found I had to follow all of it. When I read the comment version, which said I didn't. But they do change it pretty frequently. You mentioned 2013. They're on version 2022 now. They do tend to change it every year, but as the board changes policies and procedures, they do make mid-year changes to it on occasion, because in 10 years, we're up to version 22.
20 versions. Go ahead, Steve.
So the owner of the NSPM, that is, am I correct? It is the Office of Examination and Insurance, or is it the committee itself, Todd?
It is the E&I director. Correct. And 22 versions, and every version they seem to redact a little bit more, which is podcast all for its own. But Todd, you had talked about how everything was in hard copy when we started, and then initially there was an examiner guide that went on the web page that was very consistent. It might have been outdated, but it didn't change very often. And then that started to be updated more frequently. But then, for whatever reason, NCUA either redacts or provides dead links on a lot of things that used to be in earlier versions available, which is frustrating as we try to help clients. It's frustrating for credit unions when they're trying to figure out what it is NCUA's expectations are. And it's frustrating for me when I compare it to what FDIC does. And that again, that's a topic for a whole other podcast. It's a topic for a FOIA request that I just never seem to get around to doing. But any thoughts on what you've seen there?
I think maybe a little bit more history is relevant, and maybe we should talk about it a little bit. Because at one time, the exam guide was the primary document examiners used to do their job. Then the NSPM came out. Now the exam guide has turned into kind of a mismatch of different things. And it's a good general reference document, but it's not very current. It's a mixture of a web-based access, and some of it is still the old PDF chapters that we used before, but it hasn't been kept very current. I know they started a project to make it all web-based. Geez, probably 8 or 9 years ago, and it's still not finished. If you go to that exam guide, there's a lot of areas where if you click on it, it will say content still under development. There's not an easy way to print it out, a chapter. What I would say about the exam guide is each section has a workspace or a reference section and work paper section. Those are useful, all the references there. It's probably the only useful piece of the exam guide that's left. is all that reference, because then it gives you citations to regulations, to some of the OCC documents, to some of the FDIC documents. Page 1 of the exam guide, there is a disclaimer. This is not a strict requirement unless it's noted by law or regulation. So they disclaim a lot of it. You can tell there's different authors because the new chapters are somewhat inconsistent. But I do think we should maybe just talk a little bit about agency transparency, because the exam guide used to be transparent about what examiners do. Now they've moved to the NSPM where it's transparent about processes and supervision, but their exam processes themselves are no longer transparent. Under ARES, you had questionnaires so examiners could, or credit unions could do a self-assessment of how they're doing according to what their examiners would look at. As NCUA has moved to merit, they've done away with most of the questionnaires and they have what are called job aids. None of those are public anymore. That's how the examiners do their exams. Credit unions have no access to any of those unless maybe an examiner gives them to them. So they're all hidden away. Within the NSPM, quite often there are links to some of these checklists. There's references to some of this stuff. Most of that is links to NCUA SharePoint, so the public can't see it. There are some areas that I have notes of what's redacted, so we might as well just run through it really quick.
That would be
If
great.
you're okay
Yeah,
with that.
I would love to hear the notes of what's redacted.
So there's a lot of broken links, but there are specific sections that are redacted. There's parts of the administrative actions chapter that are redacted and blacked out. I suspect some of that is their kind of decision tree is when they move from one to the other, but I don't know that because it's redacted. There's pieces to changes in officials that are redacted. And I think a lot of that is just how NCUA researches those officials' backgrounds. So it's some privacy type information. Under district management, this is the one redaction that I don't understand at all. They redact almost half of what is related to concentration risk reviews. So concentration risk has caused NCUA the greatest number of losses. But within the redacted area, they have triggers as to what they consider excessive concentrations and what they expect examiners to do. Those triggers are redacted. So NCUA is very open about where their triggers are for interest rate risk. You have a pretty good idea where their triggers are for liquidity risk. But the area that causes them the most losses, concentration risk, they're not going to tell you where their thresholds are. They have a form that says this is what we look through when you have concentrations above a certain limit. And that form basically is these are the steps they look to mitigate risk. Something that examiners would or credit unions would like to know. What are processes that we have to manage our concentration risk? Totally redacted. NCUA has a job aid on concentration risk. Tells examiners how to review concentration risk. It would be helpful for a credit union to build out their risk management processes. Totally redacted. They do have a letter out on concentration risk. It's not as specific as that job aid or what's in that actual concentration risk form. So I find it somewhat interesting that their area of greatest risk is where the agency is least transparent about what their comfort levels are.
When you put it that way, that's a pretty powerful statement. Yeah, and this is redacted, not dead link. This is
redacted, blacked out,
right? And to redact something, there has to be a legal reason not to provide it. And I was going to say, the word guarantee you is on my mind here. I want to say, I'll guarantee you that all those redactions have not been reviewed by the Office of General Counsel, especially by the volume of them coming up. And if the redactions have been reviewed, I absolutely guarantee you that with the number of dead links that they've got, that has not been reviewed. And I remember a time where I was in the audience and a board member had to testify to Congress. And they had to testify on a certain topic, but the topic that came up was the redaction of a document that the state, that NASCUS was very interested in, related to the overhead transfer calculations. And they had redacted all sorts of things because it would have made the discussion with NASCUS easier. And became a challenging discussion with Congress for the chairman of NCUA, they went around and they turned around and were ordered to go back and look at it and re-redact, make sure that they had legal reason to not redact some of that. And it turned out that it was staff didn't want to release it. It wasn't stuff that should have been redacted. But in this instance, Todd, you really nailed the issue of redaction with a very fine point here, that the agency loses money when when credit unions put too many eggs in one basket. And here they are having these rules in a black box, not explaining it to the industry. And we've had conversations with some credit unions where that has turned out to be very frustrating. And I don't think, I'm sure they could make a legal argument if they want to, but it would be good for credit unions to know where those guardrails.
I think it would. And like I said, it would help them round out their own governance and risk management processes, because those expectations are laid out in those questionnaires and in that examiner guidance, or job aid is what they call it. And they choose to not share that with us.
Especially when we're seeing an increase of NCUA saying you need to really justify what your concentration risks are. Again, it would be good to have those guardrails. Steve, any thoughts on this general topic?
Yeah, and doing kind of research for this and some other items we've been working on lately, I looked up this interagency statement on clarifying the role of supervisory guidance. It came out in 2018, and it's by the Federal Reserve, FDIC, NCUA, Office of Controller Currency. And one of the bullet points on there is the agencies intend to limit the use of numerical thresholds or other bright lines in describing expectations in supervisory guidance. That creates a problem, because we say everybody would like to know what the examiners are looking at in terms of the bright lines, for lack of a better term, in what is considered a concentration risk.
They didn't eliminate the bright lines; they just hit them.
Yeah, and so that I don't know how that sits in terms of this. And we have numerical thresholds, but is it because of this that we don't disclose it? But if the examiners have it, then they have the same effect because they're managing to those items. It's certainly in the best interest for credit unions to be able to know where those are, and then with proper other guidance NCUA issues and how those will be looked at. But that information is so useful. If the examiner is using numerical thresholds, the credit unions need to know about it, because they do pretty good documentation on where we're at with some of those interest rate risk measures, and that those are out there. And they work pretty hard on saying the credit unions can have their own, but it has created a lot of friction. And I'm sure, Todd, you'll have additional thoughts on this.
Like the interest rate risk ones, and this is the same way with their internal concentration targets. They're scope determinants. It determines that whole exam scope, and it lays out expectations for governance. With the interest rate risk and their supervisory test, they say, okay, you hit these targets. We're going to look at your processes a lot more closely. And they specifically say these are not limits on the institution. It's when our risk thresholds are triggered, and we're going to spend more time and effort on looking at how you manage interest rate risk. This is the same thing with the concentration risk. I know because I was on the committee that helped develop them and the job aids and the whole form that they use. And it becomes a scope determinant. And it would be helpful for the industry to know what those are. It would be helpful for them to even see the job aid, because here's what we're going to look to: concentration risk governance. And I would say this with all the job aids in merit. With Aries, you have the questionnaires. Credit unions could do a self-assessment of their risk management process in all those different areas. I don't know how many questionnaires were in that workbook, but they covered pretty much every area of operation. They have these job aids in merit now, and none of those are transparent and available. So credit unions, they have to use basically external types of information to do their own self-assessment. The FDIC, the comptroller of the currency, they're very transparent in their exam processes and their documents. NCUA used to be under merit, not so much anymore. But just a couple other things that are redacted in the NSPM. There's the development of critical case in this case lists. It's an internal thing, and it's really no benefit for credit unions to know how the regions do that. It doesn't impact them in any way. There's some documentation requirements for contacts shorter than 8 hours. Industry probably doesn't need to know that. There's a whole section on the FISCU program and enforcement actions that are blacked out. It's not blacked out for federals, but it's blacked out for FISCUs. And I'm not sure exactly what that is. It's probably things dealing with the state regulators is probably why they haven't blacked out, although I don't know. And then the entire quality assurance program is blacked out. And would that help credit unions or not? Maybe not. It would explain why some of them are taking months and months and months to get their exams.
Months and months. And we haven't had one that took a year yet. We had one that came close. Although that's an interesting list. And again, maybe someday I'll send some letters or some FOIA requests to NCUA to get a little bit of this information to improve the transparency for our clients and perhaps to discuss here on the podcast. Okay. And Todd, when you were talking about the examiner's guides outdated, the NSPM's really taken its place. And then of course there's letters to credit unions, which are official guidance. And then there's the reference section, which you said is the key of the examiner. I'm trying to remember. I don't recall having discussions with any clients where we saw NCUA refer back to the examiner guide or refer back to the NSPM. They'll refer back to guidance, not the NSPM or examiner's guide. You guys agree with that?
Yes, that was part of Ms. Matz's thing too, to change doors and findings to specific regulatory citations, either the ANACT regulation, letters to credit unions. So I don't remember that we ever referenced the exam guide. Most sections, like I said, in that reference section, they will list out all the regulations that are applicable to that chapter. They'll have links to some of the other regulatory agencies. Sometimes they'll cite the other regulatory agency, but it's not an actual link. You would have to go to the other regulatory agency and search it. Quite often in the web-based exam guide, there's links to the NSPM, but it takes you to page 1 because they change the NSPM frequently. So they don't give you links to the appropriate chapter in the NSPM. It just makes you go search the NSPM. I can understand why they do that because the exam guide is very slow to change. It goes through a committee process and it seems to be at the bottom of EI's list of things to update. Yeah, and like I said, it's fallen out of use as they've buried all these job aids within the merit exam program. So examiners don't reference it very often. So I can understand why it's low on NCUA's priority list and why sometimes we don't have links to actual places because those links get outdated and frustrations. But by giving titles of things to look up, it's helpful. And like I said, in the exam guide, those reference sections at the end of each chapter can be very helpful if credit unions are searching on a specific topic. I don't know that credit unions use it very much anymore because, like I said, it's very difficult. You can't download a chapter to a PDF. You can download the NSPM and search it. You can't do that with the exam guide anymore. So it's a difficult to use reference source.
And I'll put a link in the show notes to the link to the redacted version of the NSPM that we're referring to. Now, I mentioned exam reports and what you can cite to, and a couple great podcasts coming up that weave into the NSPM, the examiners, etc. Camel Code 3s. What do you do now that you're Camel Code 3? What do you do now that you're Camel Code 4? What do you do when NCUA asks to meet with your board of directors without the CEO present? And we also have one that either has come out just before or just after this one that will be document resolutions and project management as it relates to that. So a lot of good content coming to your regular listeners as you gear up, as you get out of summer and you gear up for your next exam. So anything else? Go ahead, Tom.
One little sidelight on the NSPM and the exam guide. I said they don't keep the exam guide links current. They usually do to the NSPM. But the NSPM references the exam guide into several specific areas with enforcement actions. It references specifically chapters 29 and 30 of the exam guide in multiple places. But those chapters of the exam guide are not available to the public. I don't know that it was intentional, but they're not there.
I firmly believe that there's some intent and there's some just oops that's going on. Because it's hard to keep all the links alive and running, which is a good segue to the fact that, Steve, in your former life at NCUA, you wrote NCUA's enforcement manual. There is a redacted version out there. I have a redacted version of that if anybody's interested in getting it. But any thoughts on the enforcement chapters being done or enforcement in general, Steve?
The enforcement manual was actually issued as an NCUA instruction. This had to do with the politics of the NCUA board at that moment. So that's a whole nother story. One thing that we've found in the NSPM with our clients that we worked with is the process that deals with the processing of administrative actions. So it's been really helpful for the credit unions to know that they have to respond within 30 days or whatever. And we're able to point them as to those timeframes that they become subject to with some notices and in response to those particularly administrative actions, I think has been a part of it that we've shared with our clients more regular than any other parts.
Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, the 30 days to appeal, we have a separate podcast on appeals, a couple separate podcasts on appeals that are out there. Generally speaking, appeals, they make sense depending on how you define victory of an appeal. Because it's hard to get something overturned, but sometimes you can get your point made or a few things changed, but not win like a camel code over, for example. But now I'm going down a rabbit hole. If you're interested in appeals, check that out on another podcast. Very good, guys. Any last thoughts here as we wrap up? Any questions I should have asked you as it relates to the Examiner Guide or NSPM? Or any thoughts you want to make sure we hit?
I would just say for credit unions, if they want to dig into the NSPM, the chapters to look at for the most part that impact them are those chapters on district management. It explains how your examiners behave and schedule things. Then there's separate chapters for federal programs and FISCU programs. Those chapters will lay out how the whole exam process and timeline works. If you just look at nothing else, just look at those and it'll give you a general idea of how your examiners are operating and how your exams get scheduled and things of that nature. If you want to look at a regulatory waiver for any reason, whether it's for derivatives, for non-member deposits, for bank purchases, mergers, there is a chapter in the NSPM on regulatory waivers that covers all of that, which credit unions might find helpful if they're seeking one of those specific regulatory waivers.
I will say that unless it's changed, the bank purchase had some dead links. That's what actually got me onto the topic in my mind of a potential FOIA, because they issued a proposed rule saying they were going to clarify what it takes to get a bank purchase and that it would be in the NSPM. Then they never issued the final rule, but the NSPM is redacted. So that was actually went to NCUA and talked to them a little bit about that, which led me to the point where I had to do a FOIA and just have got around to it. Very good, guys. This has been a lot of fun, bringing back some old memories. I never expected to bring up Bosch and Dave Matthews in the same podcast. I did here today, so that's kind of cool. Thanks, guys.
Have a great day.
And this is Mark Treichel. I want to thank you, the listener, for listening. I hope you'll listen again soon. Mark Treichel signing off with Flying Colors.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of With Flying Colors. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app to hear future episodes where subject matter experts of all varieties will provide tips on how to achieve success with NCUA. If you would like to learn more about how we assist credit unions, check out our services at marktreichel.com.